Kylie, and today I will be talking about A/B testing, taking a deep dive into how Vercel achieves experimentation at scale without sacrificing performance. Today we're going to cover what A/B testing actually is, defining it as a concept, why your team should consider introducing A/B tests, how to design a balanced experiment or A/B test, executing that experiment, and then at the end we'll do a demo of A/B testing using Edge middleware in a Next.js application. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about my team. So my name is Kylie Czajkowski. I am the engineering manager of the growth team here at Vercel, and I work with 6 other engineers to partner with growth managers, analysts, and a designer to design and implement data-driven experiments. This means that my team takes the time to think about user journeys in the application and what metrics help us understand them better. We also work with other teams within Vercel to improve features and iterate over ideas. So let's talk about what A/B testing actually is. You might actually be familiar with this concept already. A/B testing is also known as split run or bucket testing. It is the strategy of comparing 2 or more versions of an interface against each other to determine which performs better. Otherwise known as experiments, A/B tests present a variant to a user at random, and this will help you unlock a better understanding of user behavior, seeing how folks interact with that variant and whether they prefer the control to the variant or certain elements of that variant. So the best A/B tests or experiments should be simple, focused, and measured. This means that they should be simple in how they look at limited variables, maybe only changing a subset of variables or a component at any given time, focused in on 1 or 2 key metrics, really understanding what the user journey is through that metric and how that conversion impacts performance in your application, and then closely measured and driven by that data. So the metrics that you're assessing should also be driving the decision-making at the end of your experiment. So now that we've defined A/B testing, let's ask ourselves why you might be interested in A/B testing. So I've seen a number of benefits to A/B testing firsthand, but I'd like to highlight just a few that I think are the most impactful to dev teams. So the number one benefit of A/B testing that I'd like to highlight is the improved user understanding. By deepening your understanding of user goals, you can better your product to suit those needs. If we understand what folks are looking for out of your application, you can better highlight those features or get that user journey a little bit cleaner, tighter, and better understood so that your user is not having a frustrating experience and you're providing the best possible experience within your application. Another great benefit of A/B testing is that your results are backed by data, so they're a lot harder to argue with. By gathering a wide range of metrics, you empower your team with the data that they need to make critical decisions. Using empirical evidence, you can make larger overarching changes to features within your application and have an idea of what measurements you'd actually like to see, how they would perform, and whether you would like to turn that variant off, potentially end your experiment early based on a metric that's performing lower, or if maybe you ship it directly to alpha because the experiment is performing so well at the time of statistical determination. Another benefit to A/B testing that I've seen is increased conversions. And while this might not necessarily be your dev team's metric, this is something that will benefit your organization as a whole. No matter what application you're building, by targeting and improving the metrics that matter most to your organization, you can make that user experience better for the end user of your platform. Finally, a benefit that I've seen of A/B testing firsthand is the ability to get out of your own way. You and your dev team might get a little caught up in what you should be shipping, what you should be focusing on next. By running experiments and shipping these smaller, focused, concentrated studies, you can gain insight into how features perform and run with it. This allows you to really empower your team to reduce that fear of shipping, prepare to fail, and then iterate, knowing that not every experiment is going to be perfect or give you exactly the results you're looking for. That's fine. Just being able to ship and improve is a measure in and of itself. So now that we've covered some of the benefits of A/B testing, let's talk about some of the counter arguments or the more common arguments against A/B testing. So one argument that I've heard is user research should be a higher priority, and I don't disagree with that. Some teams might argue that A/B testing negates user research by making decisions on their own. I would argue that they should be working in parallel. User research should drive the experiments that you are looking to introduce to the application. By understanding what might work or not work for your users and what kind of feedback they're giving, you can better improve those features and that experience overall within the application. So user research should actually work in tandem with experiments and not against. Another argument that I've heard against A/B testing is experiments are just stabs in the dark. And this isn't necessarily untrue, but so are features. Experiments and features are both just an effort to change the application in a way that you're assuming might be beneficial. An experiment just takes that extra step to declare a hypothesis, determine what metric would actually move the needle on that hypothesis, and then go back to the drawing table once your experiment has concluded and determining whether your hypothesis has been proven, disproven, or something else entirely, something unexpected that maybe happened during the course of your A/B test. Experiments should build on the last one. So the more a team is executing and iterating, the more informed they will become about that user experience. A final argument against A/B testing is that changes this small are simply too low impact. And I would say that team health is important, and you should be considering small and large lift projects at any given time within your product. An application is not meant to be just large ships, huge features forever. That's how we end up with tech debt. I think we've all been there. It's really important to focus on a wide range of changing and take bets with your experiments. So not just changing the button, seeing how a person might engage with a different CTA, but giving them more information, maybe allowing the user to make a more informed decision with some additional information that you might present, or moving something that they typically are looking for when they first land on your application to that first page, so there's a little less of a click-through rate. So in designing an experiment, we should be considering a number of things. Your team should be asking themselves questions about how they want to see this implemented. A few questions that you can start with are, what do you want to see change? Just like you might ask yourself for any other feature, what do you think would look best on the platform, the application that you're developing? What do you expect to happen as a result of this? Do you think your users are going to enjoy that experience, or do you think they might bristle to it? What does this change actually look like, and how do you anticipate user interaction to be affected? Some other questions you can continue this thought process along with are, do you have a hypothesis? Do you think that user behavior is going to culminate into some kind of conclusive action? What metric do you think is going to be affected by this change? Is maybe a conversion metric going to be targeted, a number of people signing up for your application, or maybe another metric entirely? How many people are using a page for a longer duration of time? Maybe you've implemented a feature that would demand the user stays on the page for a little longer, and you can assess whether they're actually interacting with the feature by looking at that session length. Experiments are meant to test a hypothesis. So how can we best assess that hypothesis? What behavior should be measured? What is that metric? These are all questions that you should be thinking about as you decide what you would like to experiment with next. Deciding what should be changed should also depend on what would improve that user's experience, as I keep saying. Highlighting a feature that might help them or presenting additional information can go a very long way in a simple application. Also, be sure to consider novelty skew. As you're presenting an entirely new or unique experience, it might contrast a little too harshly with your control or the original user experience. And that's something to be considered. That might very genuinely affect your metric in a very significant way. So as we just discussed, let's really hone in on these three things you should be considering as you're evaluating an experiment. Focus in on that metric. So think about conversion, click-through, bounce, all of these user behaviors that are going to indicate how they're responding to this feature. Keep your changes small. The more focused an A/B test is, the more tightly you can iterate and improve on that change, and maybe even apply your findings to other pages within the application. Finally, preparing to iterate is truly the key to this process. Time boxing your statistical significance determination, figuring out what metric and how your user base impacts it, and then what length of time is a reasonable amount of time to take a look at that metric, and what window gives us the best insight into a common user behavior or a common user experience within that platform. So now that we've discussed the best way to design an experiment, let's take a look at some of the traditional methods used to tackle experimentation. So one of the traditional methods is server-side rendering. This is something that can be achieved in a Next application very simply. Built at the moment of request, this method allows for personalized content based on user data, or you can just modify the response based on what you'd like that user to see. So server-side rendering does allow you to modify what's presented at the end in that request time. Sometimes information is fetched via a round trip to an origin server, maybe something hydrating a feature flag that you're using to determine what this user is. That can add latency to this call. So increased latency is always going to decrease your web vitals, and that's something that should seriously be considered as you develop a server-side experiment. SEO can also be lower because this personalized data is not available until hydration. So depending on what information you are trying to modify for the user, be mindful of what is going to actually show up in your SEO as well. Those decreased web vitals are very impactful to user behavior. We've seen time and time again that increased latency leads to 20 or plus higher bounce rate on average. So a lot of users just don't like that long wait time. I know I personally don't either. While SSR is not an imperfect solution, these are all just things you should be aware of as you develop and design your experimentation framework. So another traditional method to achieving A/B testing is client-side rendering, which defers that rendering work to the user's device, running JavaScript on the browser of their device after the page has loaded. A lot of A/B solutions do use client-side rendering. It's not uncommon. We can dynamically modify the DOM to present that user's information, but this can result in content flickering, cumulative layout shift, depending on where the HTML was at the moment the page was rendered versus when it was hydrated. You need to be very mindful of how that shift might actually impact the user behavior. Once again, some of the downsides of this are decreased web vitals. So that bad user experience, cumulative layout shift will always be frustrating and something that you should absolutely be considering. Reducing cumulative layout shift can lead to higher page views per session, longer session duration, a decrease in bounce rate, and other benefits for your end user. So let's talk about how Vercel has achieved experimentation at scale while not sacrificing performance. Why is Edge middleware so much better? The answer really is just that middleware is at the edge of the network, so it's closest to the user. You get to use this cache to serve up that personalized content even quicker, allows you to execute code before the request is even processed, which by living between the code and data center makes SSR just that much quicker. The flexibility to add personalization to any part of your application is one of these benefits of using Edge middleware in combination with SSR to render your A/B tests. Code instead of configuration. Spend less time getting infrastructure set up to support your experiments and more time just writing the code, just implementing these features and learning from your changes. A/B testing on the server side with Edge middleware also reduces layout shift. So that improved site performance, those increased web vitals are going to culminate into a better experience for your user. So now that we've talked about the what and why of A/B testing, let's walk through a demo of how to introduce an A/B test using Edge middleware to an existing Next.js application. So I've gone ahead and created this Next.js app using create next app TypeScript. And I went and moved the buttons that you might be familiar with seeing over here onto an about page, because I'd like to focus our experiment in on just the about page for today. So we still have our index, and then we have this about. My hypothesis is that the examples and deploy button should be higher up so that they get a little bit more engagement. I think they're of more appeal to our user, and I'd like to see if they perform better if we put them higher priority on this page. So the A/B test that I want to introduce is focused in on that. I just want to move the examples and deploy buttons up. I don't want to cause layout shift for that user or the person who might see the control. I want to make sure that they still have access to the original page, but I also want to vary these buttons for users that are thrown randomly into a second bucket so that they see these other buttons in a different location. So to start, you're just going to go ahead and create a middleware.ts file right at the root of your application. So this file is going to follow a pretty standard convention of middleware, and it's definitely a format that you need to get familiar with if you want to write a lot of middleware functions, because they all start the same way. So you're going to write your middleware export default function. It's going to take in this next request. And this is the key to the middleware. It's looking at the requests, and it's going to rewrite the response based on a couple of qualifiers. So at this point, we're taking that request, and I would like to assess it against maybe an object of known experiments, known paths that we'd like to modify. So I'm just going to find this type real quick to allow us to have more insight into what that structure of an experiment actually looks like, and hopefully build on this as we move forward. But buckets is going to be a read-only string. I'm going to define them in a library. And then this type is going to be in the middleware to help us substantiate what we actually expect to see from these buckets. So let me just go ahead and define the bucket that I would like to see defined here. So about buckets. And this one needs to have our intended variants. So I'm calling the control original, and then new CTA will be our variant name. This is what's actually going to be provided to the cookie in order for Next to know to rewrite that URL. So these are the titles that I'm working with. And since I've defined them, I'm going to bring them back over here. So now I can declare a routes object that is a record that references the type I've just defined up top. And it's either going to have route type or undefined, just because. And here we go. So this is where we can scale this out as we continue to add pages that we'd intend to experiment with. This is where we can actually call the cookie what we'd like. So I'm going to call it bucket about. You can call it obviously anything you'd like, maybe even something a little more secretive to your user. But for now, we'll go with bucket about because it's a little more obvious what's going on. As you scale this out and implement it in an enterprise system, you might lean on a third party to set that cookie for you, to define what that string should actually be. Maybe you would like to hash it so it's a little less obvious to your user what's being experimented with. Or maybe the feature flag is defined by something else entirely, a feature that you're releasing or showing to the user, and you'd like to pass it a different string. That's fine, entirely up to you. Another element of this middleware that we're going to need is a config. We need to apply a matcher so that this middleware knows which routes it needs to be matched to when to actually do what it's doing. So now that we know what our experiments are going to look like and what that list of experiment routes looks like, let's go ahead and take a look at the next URL that's going to come in from this request. So the path name can be used to actually rewrite, oh, I spelled that wrong, to rewrite the response. But what we're going to use it for is to reference the routes object that we just created up there and see if the path name exists, if it's one of the ones that we wanted to do something with. If it doesn't, we'll just go ahead and exit out of this middleware. Now, the other steps we're going to need to take in this file are get the bucket from the cookie. We're going to need to set that cookie if there's no active bucket, or if the cookie is invalid. And then we need to rewrite the response to Next. So this is going to be the other element that's a lot more commonly shared among your middleware. But first, let's go ahead and talk about what that bucketing algorithm is going to look like. So typically you will have, like I said, a third-party library or similar to actually help you bucket your users. Maybe that's what's going to split your traffic. Maybe you can meter if the test is still on in some kind of third-party UI. All of these things are possible. To do just a very simple hand-rolled algorithm, I'm going to actually use an algorithm that we use in some of our examples on Vercel.com. So this hand-rolled bucketing algorithm is just going to randomly generate a bucket for your user using the node crypto get random values function. So let me go ahead and define that helper first. We're going to use the crypto namespace here in node. We're going to get random values. Again, this is just meant to be easy to extend kind of bucketing solution, not necessarily the perfect solution. And this will just throw our users into, bucket A, B, C, D, whatever we determine that number actually is. So now that we have this crypto random function, let's move on our logic here. We're going to let num equal crypto random. We'll use that to actually get our random number between 0 and 1. From here, we'll determine how many buckets actually need to be generated. So 100 divided by, however many buckets are defined in that record type. And then here, we're going to hopefully very simply throw our users into that bucket. So if the number is less than 0, great. That's the bucket they're in now. So this should work for our needs here. Let's go back to the middleware and actually see it in action. So we haven't set up our cookies just yet, but I do know the syntax because it's coming off of that request object. We're going to go rec.cookies.get, check to see if the cookie we know we're checking for exists. And then just to be extra safe, let's go ahead and set this Boolean to not bucket. So now if there's no bucket, or if there's no bucket on the route, making sure plural bucket isn't too confusing, then we're going to go ahead and set that bucket to one that is generated by our randomization algorithm. So bucket sort, I'm common enough JavaScript problem. There are 100 ways to write this algorithm. I just went with one of the simpler ones. So now we're going to need to actually define that res down here. So we'll get there, but that res is what's going to actually be returned by this middleware. For now, let's just make sure we have this logic tight. So has bucket should be false. We'll continue to leverage this Boolean to just see if maybe there's a malformed cookie anywhere in this middleware. And now we're going to rewrite that response. So let's go ahead and grab the URL. We're going to set the path name to what we want to see, which is going to be entirely based in that route and bucket. So we know bucket will be the extension and then route.page because that's that about route. So technically Next.js is going to see here, and then that's what's actually being served in. So it knows to reroute the user that is in this bucket to the page that the bucket is applicable to. Now we haven't actually stood up that redirect just yet, but we will in just a moment. So this res now is going to look like a rewritten response using that URL that we just set, which will be dependent on the variant that this user is supposed to be in. Great. So now that we have our middleware actually written, let's go ahead and move over into the original page, our control. So let's rename it to original to match the convention that we just set. And then we'll call this one bucket, so we can use the get static paths to generate it. So original is going to go here. We're just going to copy all of this right on over. And I'm going to rename it for ease of understanding. Oh, not TS, but TSX. So from here, we can go ahead and we're going to check and set that cookie just so that you have a visual as to what's going on here. And we'll talk a little bit more about it as we do it. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the router so that I can start using it to check some things for me. I'm going to go ahead and first import the type defs I know I need. So yarn add JS cookie, because that's going to be my preferred library for these. And I want to make sure I get the types too, because, you know, we're here over in JavaScript. Great. I also want to make sure this is imported correctly. Excellent. So router is now using useRouter. We're also going to start working with those cookies. So let's go ahead and give the users a way to set their bucket instead of setting it ourselves indirectly. We're just going to add some buttons here so we can see this behavior in real time. I need it automatically invoked because it's going on a button. It's going on an on-click event. Cookies should have auto imported, but I guess not today. And then cookies.set, and we're going to use that known cookie name. We could reference it from the record, but just so you see what we're doing here. And then let's reload that router as soon as it's done. So we have this set bucket function. Let's go ahead and plug it in. And we're going to go ahead and map over the buttons, the variations that we have, not buttons, the buckets, to create buttons. So I am going to go ahead and bring in a, which is a class that I have. So about buckets, I'm going to map over them. And then I'm going to just create a button for each bucket. And that button is going to need a key. And it's going to need it's going to need to call that function to actually set the bucket. So one more thing I think I'd want to have on this page just to see the visual of setting and potentially removing the cookie. Let's go ahead and define a remove bucket function, a helper function here that is going to automatically invoke itself to immediately remove the known cookie. So we have the remove property here on this namespace, and we're going to do what we did before, reload once that's done. So now that we have this remove bucket, let's go ahead and add one more bucket, remove cookie. And key, it doesn't need a key. We do need, however, to pass it that remove bucket function. So great. Now we have a button to remove the cookie, a button to apply that new cookie, and then an original cookie. So that control page will always be accessible, not necessarily needed. You don't need to remove the bucket cookie to see the original page. The original page is just the control. So it does serve as bucket A, and the new CTA serves as bucket B. So now that we actually have buttons to make changes here, let's go ahead and do one more thing. I think I want to know what our current bucket is. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that. And then I'm going to tell the user that instead of they're not currently in a bucket, I'm going to go ahead and say, you are currently in bucket, and then we'll call it current bucket. And maybe just to make it a little more clear, to uppercase. Great. So I'm already in the new CTA bucket. I've already just been bucketed by the algorithm. It's just something that has happened. So two more things we're going to need to define on this variant page is the get static paths, so that Next knows where to direct us. And we're going to reference the buckets to do that. So go ahead and grab all the buckets, filter them down. And then the bucket that does not, so that needs to no longer be original. And those are all of the variations of this page that we're going to want to see. So we should turn those into paths. Keep going plural with the JavaScript methods. Bucket should be, and this is more syntax that's specific to Next.js, that those params need to be passed in through the get static paths. So get static paths should always return paths, and then you can use this fallback function to add additional retry info. Get static paths won't work without get static props, even if you're not really applying additional information. But just so you do know, you could use this method to add more information about your bucket or the user or anything else. Just other information that you want this page to be aware of when it loads is what can go right in that object here. You can return it in any capacity, and these will populate as props here up at the top. And you can destructure them accordingly. So if there's something in particular you wanted to see on this page, get static props would be the place to affect that change. So we do still want to see these buttons over on our original page. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy those over. And because you're not currently in a bucket on this page, that's not needed. We do need the set and remove functions. Again, just copying and pasting some stuff around here. And then that cookie's auto import needs to be handled. Same is said for these router. Great. So now we have everything we need to actually wire up this A/B test. And from here, we only need to, go check it out. So as you can see, I've been bucketed into the new CTA bucket just already. I'm going to remove my cookie, and I'm no longer in a bucket. Let's go ahead and see the original page, which is the same as this page. I'm not currently in a bucket, or that's the behavior we've put on. And then once again, I'm right in new CTA. So let's go ahead and implement that experiment that I've been saying I wanted to see tried. So these are all the buttons. There's going to be a cleaner way to do this for sure, but this is a nice and straightforward way to see what's going on. So if current bucket equals new CTA, let's go ahead and render a different set of those buttons, but I'm going to make sure the originals still get included. So new CTA, as you can see right now, I just fully removed them from this page. What I want to do instead is just move them around. So now you can see that behavior, documentation and learner at the top in the original, the control, and the new CTA has them changed. At the end of the day, your user wouldn't be the person interfacing with these buttons. I don't know that we necessarily have a good habit of giving the users that, remove cookie button to click themselves. But just so you can see what's happening in real time here, this is how you can run an A/B test and how you can see what those variations actually look like. So I'm still not in a bucket, returning back to that page because it recognizes my cookie. And now I've been rebucketed. I'm back in the new CTA bucket. So as you can see, the solution is very quick. Obviously, it's a fairly warm cache as well, but very, very quick, very responsive. And deployment is as easy as just running VC deploy. So now that we've finished the demo, let's talk through what we just did. First, we created that middleware file. So in an existing Next.js application, you can define middleware to actually run that bucketing algorithm on incoming traffic and bucket your user accordingly. The provider needs to be defined. So however you plan on bucketing, be it a simple algorithm defined in your library or an external library like Split.io, LaunchDarkly, StatSig, anything can be used for this bucketing determination. It's entirely up to you. Once the middleware has been defined, you're going to need to clarify which variants you'd like to serve to that user. So be it an entirely different page like we did in the demo, or moving a couple of buttons around, just varying the components depending on the actual experiment that's being run, which bucket your user is in. These are all things that can be modified on command because of the Next.js application infrastructure. And then finally, to actually measure the performance of your experiment, you're going to want to assess analytics. And in our Vercel application, we actually have access to a new analytics tool that can help you assess where user traffic is coming from, what pages they're spending the most time on, and maybe what the next action is for your user. So looking at Vercel analytics on the platform, you're going to have insight into page views, visitors at any given time within a range of time or a date. You get that real experience score. So all the web files that were previously available in Vercel analytics are also still available. You just get to make more decisions and see how user interactivity can be changed as a result of your processes. So using Vercel analytics, we can get a better insight into how users are engaging with our website and learning more about what makes them happy. So thank you so much for listening to my talk about A/B testing. Really hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or want to talk about this content further, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. Thank you.